Welcome back to the Free Spirits Podcast. Today, David and I are excited to sit down with a guest who's merging beer culture, beverage innovation, and cannabis in a truly original way. Gordon Whelpley is the founder of Float House, a Connecticut-based beverage company crafting THC infused drinks designed to give you the refreshment of a great brew without any alcohol. An award-winning brewer with deep roots in the craft beer world, Gordon is now building something that's pushing the boundaries of what a infused beverage experience can be. Welcome, Gordon.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned at the intro, though, you've spent many years in the craft beer world, brewing, teaching. I believe you even helped define a few different beer styles. What what was that aha moment that led you to want to launch Flow House?
Well, it actually all kind of goes back to the Craft Brewers Conference in Denver in 2019. I had, been in brewing my entire professional career, everywhere from Magic Hat out in California at El Segundo, and I did my brewing education out there before moving back to the East Coast and was working at Stony Creek, all with the intention of starting a brewery someday. And, wanted to work every job and understand every facet of the business before doing that. And by the time I did that, opening up a brewery just didn't make any sense anymore to me. And I was out at the Craft Brewers Conference, and this was right when Keith Villa had released the first infused non-alcoholic brew. And I went out to a dispensary. I grabbed one. It's a higher dose than I was really ready for then. It was 10 milligram IPA, and I drank that and had the best night I had ever had at a Craft Brewers Conference. I drank minimal alcohol, laughed my ass off, and I was like, this is it. That same conference, there was a series of seminars where there was a woman from BDSA, the analytical company, kind of talking about, hey, beverage is less than 1% of the total market here, but it's awesome, and you guys should be looking at this. And, that is where I started to pull thread on infused bev.
So, Gordon, I love that you had the epiphany while you're out and about. You tried this novel product out in the wild, and it kind of flipped on your head what you wanted to focus on. You said breweries are out of the question, but all of a sudden this new product line comes around, and here you are. And so, I think one of the things that's been the most fascinating for me about this category is I've been waiting for this product type to start to permeate and fill this gap in the market. And so it's been a fascinating product to follow. So at Float House that you are beer people, but technically THC beers aren't allowed under TTB regulations, and Float is not a beer. But I asked Lars before the show if I did a blind taste test and I gave you two of these products, one's beer, one's Float House, could you tell me which is which? And he said no. And so for me, my understanding was that for this product to be compliant, it must be 0.0% alcohol. Can you just walk me through the science, the process? Like, how did you figure out how to do this? And then, like, what are those kind of guardrails that you need to be cognizant of as you go to market so that people aren't saying, hey, this is an awesome THC beer, and then all of a sudden you have a huge, target on your back. How do you guys navigate all this?
Well, it is not easy, not remotely. And our products are very much beer inspired. We look at what we've done here as kind of the next evolution of this category of beverages. And, the way we do it really gets into kind of semantic definitions by different regulatory bodies about how they what constitutes a beer or a malt beverage and how it's made and kind of the order of operations for the creation of this beverage. So we, in our facility here in Windsor, are not a brewery. We're a FDA food and beverage facility. We do no fermentation or alcohol creation of any sort here. And we work with a contract manufacturer to make a fermented but dealcoholized beverage base that does not contain hops.
Does not. Okay.
And, per TTB's definition of a beer, it needs to be fermented with both malted barley and hops. So we receive that, and the addition of hops happens on our end for flavor and aroma. There is no fermentation that takes place or could take place. We receive a pasteurized ingredient and we do the blending and final infusion and packaging, and then we pasteurize again for a safe product.
What was that R&D process like? You have all these guardrails, right? You have all these legal definitions, and legal definitions, frankly, is like the whole spirit of this entire category. You're finding
Yeah.
what's the boundaries, how far can I push this thing? But what was that R&D process like? Like, obviously you tried this product, you were like, okay, this is the next thing. And then when you went kind of back to the drawing board, what did you guys do? Did you just look up the laws and like highlight stuff and say, okay, can't do this, it's got to be this? And like, how many
It
renditions
is,
did it take? Like,
yeah,
what was it like?
arduous. It was, there was several times in the entire process where I thought the whole thing was dead in the water, because the reality is the regulations are not clear. There's a lot of like gray area that is not, you can't get a response from the TTB that will give you anything. It also depends on who you reach that day, and they're like, you can't do that, or you could do that. So we're getting like conflicting answers, and working with the Ben from ABV and the rest of there was a subcommittee for a little bit in the Hemp Beverage Alliance, kind of tackling this issue, and its never-ending complexity. The whole process was a exercise in just beating my forehead against the wall, and eventually we kind of broke through with some, kind of a little bit of clarity from the TTB, and then a couple epiphanies about process and figuring it out. And so the other side of that is, how do you make a good tasting product that meets, my standards, and then the standard of the consumer for, we want to build this category, and you have to do that with great tasting liquid. I also want to drink this. This is a product that is solving, for, my own, desires as well. I stopped drinking alcohol a couple years ago, and, it's the best time in history to be, drinking beer without alcohol in it. There's many times when I would kind of reach for that end of day beer and be like, man, I could use like a little bit extra in this. I could use just a little unwind after, beating my head against the wall. And so that was the drive to do it. And then lots of iterations to get, because it is not a traditional brewing method. These dealcoholization, the process in and of itself, you need to do a lot of recipe tailoring to get your desired outcome, and then a lot of experimentation with, kind of new hop products that have come out to the market, and just a lot of work.
That's like it.
Yeah. So your first two products, THC IPA and THC Light, which for everyone in the audience, if you haven't tried them yet, you should absolutely go try them. They are delicious. And as someone who also has quit drinking for almost a couple years now, the only thing I missed was beer. So these two products clearly borrow from that style of beverage. How did you go about, recreating those flavors without the alcohol? Obviously, you've kind of touched on this a little bit. But the no hops portion, it was interesting in your last answer. Kind of walk us through a little bit more in depth, if you would, that adding of the hops for flavor, but without brewing with the hops. And then, are you also
Yeah,
adding any terpenes or anything?
not currently, but we will be. Well, I mean, hop terpenes are, inherent
Yeah.
in this. But we do have some plans for, say a double IPA with some additional terpenes added to it down the line. There's, I guess, to do, figuring out that guardrail. So hops are added for like multiple different reasons to a beer at different parts in the process. You're looking for bitterness. They provide a degree of antimicrobial benefits, which is great during fermentation, as you're allowing yeast to propagate and kind of dominate the ecosystem within the fermenter. And that goes back to the original creation of IPA. They would just, and it wasn't just pale ale that they were doing it to. They were just stuffing hops into every barrel of beer, so it would show up after a long voyage, not totally filled with lactobacillus and tasting awful. So you had like a passable beverage to drink when you're in India. So, we had to look at that and then say, okay, we'll take this framework of a recipe they put together and then figure out how that comes through the dealcoholization process and then work on building back in what we know is needed for it. So, bitterness. Also, you may notice in a lot of non-alc beers that the bitterness seems pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
I picked that up on a bunch of athletic stuff, and that is one of the ways you can build in perception of body. The lack of ethanol in a non-alc beer really thins it out. You may have noticed that in some non-alc beers. You're like, man, this tastes like a barley pop or barley seltzer. This was almost there, but I just wish there was some more to chew on. So hops add a lot to the entire sensory perception of it. So your body, your flavor, your aroma, and looking at something like light, which is pretty minimal hop character. They're in that we've got just a minimal amount of bitterness and the barest hint of some noble hops. I've got, some Saaz, some Czech Saaz that is added to just give the roundness needed to balance it out. And that one was the first one that we worked on. With a lager, you don't have room to hide anything. There's not much to it. So getting that up to snuff was definitely a challenge. Figuring out the active side of it as well with the addition of water-soluble THC and CBD. And originally we had THCV in there as well, but we cannot do that in Connecticut. Trying to lean more into the uplifting social aspect of these beers. They're meant to be, and I think beer specifically, our drinking occasion is beer drinking occasions, and then bringing those into also non-alc beer drinking occasions, which really opens up the entire day for a lot of people.
Yep.
And we wanted to launch with something that was, sessionable. You could have several of these over the course of the day, and one that's like basic beverage business. Your low margin and high volume. You're looking for that, and then two, like this is like my sweet spot, 3 milligrams, and being able to enjoy the beer, enjoy the float, and still be present with say my kids on a weekend, and whatever we're doing is that's the kind of experience I wanted.
Yeah, I love that. So Lars and I were just talking about this. A bunch of drinks coming out that have things like nootropics, functional mushrooms, other minor cannabinoids like CBG, and it makes a ton of sense. It's exactly what you're saying. If you just go have straight THC, like you might get tired and not want to continue to drink that. And if you have these other components that make it more social, more uplifting, then to your point, you're going to equate that beverage with a social occasion. It's going to be something you share with people. It kind of fills that gap of alcohol a bit cleaner than like a NyQuil or something. And so it's really interesting to hear you guys say, THCV. That used to be one of my favorite cannabinoids in Minnesota before they took it away.
Yeah.
Like that in a gummy factor, a drink factor. I think Happy has a version of it. That's kind of this direction of beverage that I think makes a ton of sense, which is, THC will be one of many other functional ingredients that engineers sort of affect an outcome. And so the next question I wanted to ask you, which you kind of alluded to previously, was how did you guys come up with your 3 milligram THC and 6 milligrams of CBD? Lars and I have a bingo card going where we have like cannabinoid dosages, entourage, like the different combinations. And you are the first one that has 3 milligrams of THC and 6 CBD. Lars, correct me if I'm wrong, but from a beverage standpoint, this is the first time we've seen this kind of combination before. So I'm wondering, was this like a market feedback thing? Was this like you guys in a lab saying, this is how I feel, I'm going to run with this?
This is interesting. So a couple things on this. Originally, these were 2.5 milligrams THC, 5 CBD, and 5 THCV. This was both out of our own anecdotal experience at that dose. When Connecticut dropped the milligram limit from 5 milligrams to 3, we said, okay, what's half a milligram? We don't want to miss out on the, milligram shopper. We'll go up to 3 and then 6 and 6, but then we lost the other 6 in that same thing. So we ended up at 3 and 6, and it's interesting because our market feedback right now is, the anecdotal feedback that we're getting is that there's too much CBD, and whether or not like that is off of just individual perception of CBD as a calming, relaxing thing, or if it's the actual CBD. I mean, everybody's system is different, and I'm not going to make any claims on that front, but we are getting
interesting
feedback like, hey, you should drop the CBD to 3. So we're looking at that, and we'll kind of see where the legislative session ends. If the bills that came out of committee kind of come through, we're going to have the ability to play with some of these things that are now deemed, as cannabis, and we're not allowed to use. There's so many opportunities to play with these cannabinoids in different formats. I wish there was a better supply. Well, it's just the reality of THCV and kind of its scarcity in hemp. Well, I think precision fermentation is like the coolest thing possible. It is, kind of a wild thing for a regulator to wrap their head around. Like, what do you mean you're fermenting cannabinoids?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, it's a natural process with some genetically modified, stuff, and you feed it a bunch of galactose, and then out comes GHCV, to summarize it briefly. And, that falls firmly into Connecticut's definition of synthetic. So we, I don't know, unless something changes on the THCV front, we're not going to be able to use that. But there's other cannabinoids that we can play
So
with
you've spoken
that
publicly.
we're looking to explore as
I
well.
was reading your testimony on, I believe it was HB 6855, about costs and confusions around regulations. So we've touched on quite a bit of this already in the conversation, but what would you say has been the biggest regulatory headache so far with Flowhouse?
Ooh, man, I don't know if there's a single one, because it just feels there's just this mountain of regulatory headaches. It's interesting because they're all, we focus on the local stuff. It's going to have the most direct impact on our business, and we will have the most direct impact on helping shape and being, a voice for the industry and manufacturers in Connecticut. So we've taken a really active role, especially this session, testifying. There's a lot of fear about this space, and it's getting out there and testifying. Testified twice this session, and it's, one was on the child resistant caps, which, that one, we found out through the testimony of DCP was like, oh, they just want a clear visual indicator that this is, not safe for kids. And, I went through and laid out, okay, well, if we're going to put on these can toppers or have to go with exo lids, here's what the associated costs would be. If we're doing the toppers and putting it in a carton, you're effectively doubling our packaging cost. And we're dealing with $1 per can tax on top of that for every can sold. It makes it pretty much impossible. And if you want a clear visual indicator, there's this really great icon that the ASTM has put together that we could just put on here, which you guys have already rejected because you consider it marketing. But this is a really good visual icon if that's what you want. And the committee and, reps and senators we've talked to, they've all been very receptive to it, even if they don't like the category. They've been really great to work with. And DCP too, we are beholden to them. We work very closely with them. Our licensing process, I guess if I were to say one thing that is the single biggest headache, is the lack of clarity in these regulations and how open to interpretation they are, and how that goalpost changes on us way more frequently than any sane person would like to deal with. We've got from a production standpoint, this massive headache of only receive active material that it comes in lower than 0.3%. So, your emulsion that's at 5 or higher is not okay. So we have to, dilute that in another state and then bring it in and send out for testing a much greater volume of emulsion. They've ignored the dry weight aspect of it. They don't care about that as long as the volume is less. But, just like that's like a real onerous one that we have to deal with, especially as we're scaling up production for our own products and our co-packing clients. Like, it's just a lot of stuff, a lot of emulsion we gotta manage. Overall, like, the future of this category is beholden to consumer trust, and regulation is necessary, but it can be onerous, especially when it's maybe not based in there's no justifiable fear for it.
Yeah, I think that's got to be the hardest part about being a lawmaker is you come up with these ideas that you think help the general public, and then you have somebody like yourself who is an operator that goes, "This is exactly what you're going to do to my P&L. Please justify this." And they're like, because you're right. Like, if you add all these unit costs, you're taxing things like all this. It's just like how can anybody survive? And so to see that play out all over the country, and it's tough, but like that's the battle that this whole category has to collectively go through together. I wanted to switch gears and ask a different kind of question here. And again, for everybody listening, this is not a beer, but you look at some of the big beer players out there, and there's kind of this split in school of thought. And I saw this play out on the regulated cannabis markets. At first, it was this kind of, looking down at the hemp market, I'm not going to get involved in that, full of synthetic, it's gas station, whatever. All these justifications. Slowly but surely, they start to change their tune. We're seeing hemp dispensaries down in Florida from MSOs. We're seeing all these MSOs launch drinks. We're seeing the Tilrays of the world. But beer is this kind of second major category. I'll call it separate from proverbial cannabis. But that whole kind of industry has shown a very interesting adoption approach. You have companies like Pabst and PBR who jumped in right away, like Sierra Nevada, very similar. You have Boston Beer Company on their earnings call saying, this is the fourth category, but there's not enough clarity yet to justify the risk. And then you have your Constellations, your Molson Coors, your AB Network, all these people. Do you think that these beer companies are going to look at a product like what you're making and say, we need to do something like this. We need to make a product like this. We need to work with somebody like Float House. Like, how do you see your product either cohabitating or becoming symbiotic with, I'll call it big beer?
Big beer is interesting, especially with the contrast to, craft beer right now, what we're seeing on that front. Big beer is inherently slow. They have, if they're publicly traded, they got to move slow. And, for there's too much to lose. If your main business is alcohol, you're not going to do anything that could put you in jeopardy of losing those TTB licenses. So, you see early adoption by, Pabst and Lagunitas and, but it is in a very separate product line. And do something akin to what we've done. I feel it is currently just probably way too much risk for anybody to take on. I think building this category into and growing it as quickly as we can with the numerous swords of Damocles that seem to be hanging over our shoulders at all times, hopefully it'll carve it out. And, with Easy Man out there beating the drum as well, it takes more than two to build a category. So we're hoping to get more entrants as well. But, it is, like I said earlier, like this is a very complicated nut to crack. I do think we'll see more, stuff like what Tilray has done, and, they'll be putting out different brands, but I would wager they're going to stay away from malt and hops for now, at least.
Do you see a world where the product that you've made today could actively be substituted pretty much anywhere that you could get a proverbial beer today? Is there a world where I could be sitting at a sporting event and go order a float house and sit down and enjoy the game.
That's the world I want to see. It is, and this is, preaching to the choir, but the inherent dangers of a product like this are so minimal, especially compared to alcohol. I've heard some that get very, well, you got to stop comparing it to alcohol. But the reality is, beverages and as alcoholic beverage as like a fundamental part of society and how we socialize as a culture. This option is what I want to see at the ballpark. I want to be able to have this instead of, not getting anything. I'll grab an athletic. Love athletic. There are our neighbors here in Connecticut. We're trying to do the same thing they did for non-alc beer for infused beverage in this style. And I think as long as none of those swords of Damocles fall down and chop our heads off,
So you
we're going to
guys
do it.
launched with a very strong brand, clever copy, clear identity. Love the packaging and everything. Who would you say is your core customer, and how
Thank you.
intentional was that brand positioning?
So, our core customers are people who want the taste of beer, but not the downsides of alcohol, but are still looking for float. And, that spans a wide demographic. We have a kind of in-house hypothesis that, current sales data skews more towards female, and, you've got older millennial and above purchasing these products in droves. We feel that there is maybe more to that than just, oh, well, women like these. Maybe that there isn't products that are positioned and marketed towards more of a male audience. And we haven't, we were very intentional with our design to not, go into the classic beer trappings of, you've got your emblem with your grains and your hops. And, we wanted to have more, to evoke more of a floaty, fun feeling. We're not positioned to, help you fall asleep. We're in essence a transportational brand. We're looking to lift you up with our product, bring you to our house, and have a party. So, it was a long journey of branding and putting it together. And I got to give huge props to my partner, Jared Emmerling, who is our chief commercial officer. And, he and I are like lockstep on the, what this brand means and how it needs to be presented. And he's done a great job of executing and working with designers to, get this.
So I like that analogy that you used. You created a moniker for your product, which is a transportation beverage. So speaking of that, where is this product going? You have two products to start. How does this brand feed into the roadmap for
Not beer.
Float House next beer comes from? Like, what does this product roadmap look like?
Not beer.
What's the next not beer that would also be
right
up with?
So, with this kind of structure of not beer, we've got a wonderful playground of styles and flavor profiles to, pull from and build off of. We've got like most brewers or former brewers that you'll talk to, we've got a deep affinity for lagers, and we have additional lagers planned, or lager-like beverages planned. But kind of immediately, we've got the double IPA, which I alluded to before. That is, at our hearts, we still, and this is, we firmly believe that the category as a whole will grow through lower dose, consumers, but they just don't know it exists yet. They need to walk into that package store or liquor store and go, what is this? I didn't know you could do this. And then, go on to the on-ramp with the, kind of realities of where sales are today outside of Connecticut. We will cater to that with a higher dosed double IPA, in 16-ounce 4-packs. We get to play with, we're bridging these two different, categories. So we get to play with the cannabis terpenes and intertwine that with hops and, create something, really wonderful to drink. So we've got double IPA or we're most likely going to be
Nice.
changing IPA to high PA. That's, because we've got THC. We wanted it to be abundantly clear what it was, but we are also, trying to be as cognizant of, what we are not and draw a firmer line before we start distributing out of state. So we've got a hazy planned as well. The light and the high PA are just to address the two largest categories. In macro beer, you have light lager, and craft beer is IPA. The formulation on those wasn't to reinvent the wheel, but just to accurately, make an approximation of these in, something that was up to our standards to regularly drink. So the hazy, the doubles, we've got a Irish stout like thing, not a stout, that we're going to be doing for next year. And we're going to play around with some sours as well, lightly fruited. So a ton of new product development stuff. That timeline is chock full of things to do. But in addition to that, we have, kind of my original thought when I first jumped into this category, and I guess it was like in 2021, and this was born out of my final job in craft beer at the 12% Beer Project in North Haven, where, we were a contract facility managing like 17 or 18 different brands at the time, including like Evil Twin and Stillwater and, some of these larger and much smaller beer brands as well. But this is kind of like in the heyday of these heavily fruited sours, and every single time we would spend 2 days kettle souring, a beer with like, in one case, beautiful floral malted bark Pilsner malt. You've got like 3 weeks of fermentation and cellaring, and then you flash pasteurize it into the bright tank, and then put 49% puree by volume on top of it. That always I was like, why does this have to be beer? And this is like at the same time as Smooge was launching their heavily fruited seltzer, and I was like, that's clear, but this would be even better with THC. Little did I know from, at that point I didn't know anything about, emulsions, colloidal stability, and proceeded to beat my head against the wall on that project as well. I guess I have an affinity for difficult to execute on products. But we've got this smoothie, which we're going to be doing later this summer. So it's like a heavily fruited tropical smoothie. It's lightly carbonated, and that's like, this one is mango and tangerine and some banana and key lime, and just delicious. So we've got those as well.
Yeah, it's a fun roadmap. I also just want to say that I'm very envious in all the puns and play on words that we get to do with beer and cannabis. So, final question I had for you, which you kind of alluded to earlier as well, was I'm in Minnesota, Lars is in Florida, you're obviously in Connecticut. So how do we buy your product, or how do people try it? You mentioned that you're dominating your backyard first before spreading your wings and having fun with the game of national distribution. So how can people try product? And I guess, what are those distribution plans,
Yeah.
timelines?
So, right now we are only available in Connecticut in either a licensed liquor store or a dispensary, and it's most likely going to be that way through the next month. We are working on the e-com front of things, and we'll be able to ship direct to consumer to all the states that allow that. But our distribution plans and our kind of position on this is born out of our experience in the beer industry, and the future of this category, like, it's going to be a dramatic shift when these are readily available anywhere a consumer goes to shop. You're going to be less likely to buy something online, especially a liquid it's insane how first doorstep. We think that's going to change, so we want to really go as deep as we can in the Northeast. Also, we have a lot of lessons we want to learn, incorporate that feedback from the consumer. There are almost no comps for our product line. because of that, and I still don't have a crystal ball for anything. We need to learn, and the value of our wholesaler and retailer relationships is, paramount to our long-term success. We're not going to be launching in Minnesota anytime soon. I feel like kind of the heyday for infused beverages, just throwing stuff up any market that will take it, is kind of over. And I don't want to be in a disparate market where we can't support the brand, and it's just doing a disservice to the company as a whole. So if we can, look at New England first, and hopefully we'll see some more changes in Massachusetts and New York, although New York seems like people are just doing whatever they want anyways. But we're kind of, as our supply chain can handle it, we're going to incrementally
Gordon, thank you
go to
so much
markets that
for
we can
joining us
back up.
today. For anyone listening
Absolutely.
who wants to keep up with the
Awesome.
journey, head over to floathouse.co and follow them on Instagram at Drink Floathouse. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please rate and review Free Spirits on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, guys, cheers.
Thanks so much. Cheers.